Hey again. You'll recall the March on Washington, in which SNCC and SCLC and the NAACP all coalesced into a single movement on the Mall in Washington in 1963 in order to show their support for the Civil Rights Act, which would later pass under Lyndon Johnson in 1964. Well, there was one observer of this event who didn't think too highly of it. His name was Malcolm X, and he wrote, "Not long ago, the black man in America was fed a dose of another form of the weakling, lulling, and deluding effects of so-called integration. It was that farce in Washington, as I recall it." So who is this Malcolm X, and what did he contribute to the civil rights movement of the late 1960s? Well, he was born Malcolm Little in Lansing, Michigan in 1925. His early life, as he put it in his autobiography, was characterized by aimlessness and petty crime. And so he ended up in prison in 1946, right after World War II, and he began there to study the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, who was the leader of a group called the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam, also known as the Black Muslims, preached a message of white evil and black self-discipline. And it was here that Malcolm Little dropped his surname and adopted the X to symbolize his separation from his African ancestry. And it was on his release from prison that Malcolm X became the leading spokesperson for the black Muslims, and as such, he became a sharp critic of nonviolence, integration, and he even targeted the teachings of Martin Luther King. He called for black solidarity to achieve their civil rights, but not on white terms, on black terms. He wrote, "We want freedom by any means necessary. We want justice by any means necessary. We want equality by any means necessary. We don't feel that in 1964, living in a country that is supposedly based on freedom and supposedly the leader of the free world, we don't think we should have to sit around and wait for some segregationist congressmen and senators and a president from Texas and Washington, D.C. to make up their minds that our people are now due some degree of civil rights. No, we want it now, or we don't think anybody should have it." Here is another quote from Malcolm X that I think distinguishes him, at least in his early years, from the mainstream civil rights movement. He said, "We are Africans, and we happen to be in America. We are not Americans. We are a people who formerly were Africans, who were kidnapped and brought to America. Our forefathers weren't the Pilgrims. We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us." Well, Malcolm X is going to hold these separationist and non-integrationist beliefs until he makes the Hajj, or a trip to Mecca, which is required of all Muslims who can make it sometime in their lifetime. And upon reflection on the Hajj experience, he writes, "Never have I witnessed such sincere hospitality and overwhelming spirit of true brotherhood as is practiced by people of all colors and races here in this ancient holy land, the home of Abraham, Muhammad, and all the other prophets of the Holy Scriptures. There were tens of thousands of pilgrims from all over the world. They were of all colors, from blue-eyed blondes to black-skinned Africans, but we were all participating in the same ritual, displaying a spirit of unity and brotherhood that my experiences in America had led me to believe never could exist between the white and the non-white." Well, upon returning from the Hajj, Malcolm X seems to have changed. He seemed more open to working with whites, and he appeared to have changed his philosophy and his theology. And so, in accordance with his newfound belief and his new understanding of human solidarity, he broke from the black Muslims and founded a new, less radical organization that would allow white participation. Now, we'll never know the full extent of Malcolm X's transformation, because he was shot and killed in 1965, and 3 members of the Nation of Islam were convicted of the murder. He started an alternative movement within the broader civil rights movement campaign, though, one more militant and less committed to nonviolence. Well, the movement continues. In 1965, a portion of SNCC the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee broke off from the main body, and they made a small yet significant change to their name. SNCC are now the Student National Coordinating Committee, so they dropped the word nonviolent, and they didn't overtly say they are going to pursue a violent commitment to civil rights, but they are saying we're not exclusively nonviolent anymore. The leader was a man named Stokely Carmichael. Now, Stokely Carmichael was the first man to use the term Black Power in 1966 to signal a move toward black solidarity and independence from white society. Carmichael and the Black Power movement said that blacks should not seek acceptance within white society, but should work to establish their own self-sustaining communities and institutions. Blacks should use their own economic and political muscle in order to gain equality. Stokely Carmichael put it like this: integration has been based on complete acceptance of the fact that in order to have a decent house or education, blacks must move into a white neighborhood or send their children to a white school. This reinforces the notion that white is automatically better and black is by definition inferior. So at first, Carmichael was a supporter of Martin Luther King and the philosophy of nonviolent resistance to injustice. But later he quipped that nonviolence was only effective, quote, if your opponent has a conscience. Well, Black Power, what was thought of as a marginal part of the civil rights movement, comes into full public view at the 1968 Olympics, in which two black athletes at that Olympics, Tommie Smith and John Carlos, stun or shock or motivate the United States viewers through displaying the Black Power symbol in full view of the world. Another group that we're going to take a look at are known as the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers were formed in 1966 by two civil rights activists named Bobby Seale and Huey Newton. Almost overnight, the Black Panthers Party becomes the symbol of the militant young black man. In October of 1966, the Black Panthers issue a platform and program known as What We Want and What We Believe. They say, we want freedom. We want power to determine the destiny of our black community. We want full employment for black people. We want an end to the robbery by the white man of our black community. We want decent housing, fit for shelter of human beings. We want education that teaches our true history and our role in the present-day society. We want all black men to be exempt from military service. We want an immediate end to police brutality and murder of black people. We want freedom for all black men held in federal, state, county, and city prisons and jails. We want all black people, when brought to trial, to be tried in a court by a jury of their peer group or people from their black communities as defined by the Constitution of the United States. The Black Panthers demand, we want land, bread, housing, education, clothing, justice, and peace. And pay attention to this one, as our major political objective, a United Nations supervised plebiscite to be held throughout the black colony in which only black colonial subjects will be allowed to participate for the purpose of determining the will of black people as to their national destiny. So, what did the Black Panthers want? Clearly they're a little bit different from Martin Luther King. They want total emancipation from white society and the freedom to determine their own destiny, social and economic policy, and define their own sovereignty. Do they want integration? No, they don't. They want to leave white society and form their own. Now, the Black Panthers, like so many other civil rights groups of the 1960s, are nothing if not dramatic. They have mastered the art of political theater. And many white Americans are frightened by the tactics of the Black Panthers, which includes a stringent interpretation of the Second Amendment. The Black Panther Party openly brandishes weapons. At one point, they entered the state capital of California in Sacramento, carrying shotguns and wearing all black leather. They appeared there to protest the state's attempt to restrict their right to bear arms and openly carry them in public. So let's look at the big picture behind what is called the rights revolution of the late 1960s. The civil rights movement awakened a new era of political and cultural reform in the 1960s and in the 1970s. Now, these groups took on the form and the language of the civil rights movement, and they began to assert themselves not as outsiders, not as adjunct Americans, but as genuine parts of the American mosaic. These are people whose voices must be heard, histories that must be told, and cultures that must be acknowledged. They are the women's movement, the Chicano movement, and also the Native American movement. The book that started the women's liberation movement was Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, published in 1963. It was a sharp criticism of the roles assigned to women in the post-war period. The domestic life was, as Betty Friedan put it, a comfortable concentration camp. Friedan helped organize NOW, the National Organization for Women, in 1966. NOW consciously modeled itself on the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, founded in 1909 by W.E.B. Du Bois. So it was intended to be a civil rights organization for women. The purpose of NOW, says its statement of purpose issued in 1966, is to take action to bring women into full participation into the mainstream of American society now, exercising all the privileges and responsibilities thereof in truly equal partnership with men. By the late 1960s, the women's movement had splintered. The new faction was younger, college-educated women, and they're fresh from the New Left, from the anti-war, and schooled in the tactics of civil disobedience and political theater. Women's Lib, as the media called them, went public at the Miss America contest in 1968. There, demonstrators carried posters of women's bodies labeled as one would beef, suggesting that society treat them as no more than meat. They condemned the industries that degraded them, such as the cosmetics industry, weight loss products, fashion magazines, and of course, the site of the location for their demonstration, the Miss America contest. And so here are a group of women discarding the items or the instruments of their oppression into what they called the freedom trash can, which is again a form of political theater in which the items that they feel degrade them are going to be publicly trashed. Among those items is the bra. Now, what could be more symbolic of 1960s radical feminism than bra burning? Well, this is again a form of political theater, a form of public protest in which women, believing that these are instruments of oppression or instruments of their own degradation, are going to publicly burn them in protest of the standards that male society places on them. One of the women that represents this bolder and more militant wing of the women's liberation movement is Gloria Steinem. She is best known as a journalist who went undercover in 1963 as a waitress in a private club owned by Playboy magazine. And she wrote up her experiences in A Bunny's Tale, published at the same time as The Feminine Mystique, 1963. Now, she discovered that the hiring process was all about physical appearance and willingness to exploit those physical attributes for the male customers. She was also horrified to learn that employment was dependent on a doctor's physical examination, including a screening for sexually transmitted diseases. Now, for what reason does one need to be cleared of venereal disease if you're going to be waiting tables, she asks, and I think the implications are clear. So with Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, the expose in Ms. magazine helped to galvanize the women's movement in the early 1960s. And here's a quote from A Bunny's Tale. "I took a last look at myself in the mirror. A creature with 3/4-inch eyelashes, blue satin ears, and an overflowing bosom looked back. The elevator opened, and I made my professional debut in the Playboy Club. It was crowded, noisy, and very dark. A group of men with name tags on their lapels stood nearby. 'Here's my bunny honey now,' said one, and flung his arms around my shoulders as if we were fellow halfbacks leaving the field. 'Please, sir,' I said, and uttered the ritual sentence we had learned from the Bunny Father lecture. "You are not allowed to touch the bunnies." His companions laughed and laughed. Oh boy, guess she told you," said one. And I tweaked my tail as I walked away. So here let's outline some of the broader goals of the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s. One of their goals was to enforce the part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that outlawed discrimination based on gender. You see, into the 1960s, advertisements for secretaries still specified female, unmarried, or even attractive as a condition for employment. So to prevent against this, women called for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, or the ERA. The ERA was a proposed amendment to the Constitution that would extend the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment specifically to women. It was introduced into Congress under Alice Paul in 1923, and the Congress passed it overwhelmingly in 1972, but the states failed to ratify it, and we will look at the reasons why. Another goal of the women's movement was to define and protect reproduction rights, including access to birth control and to abortion. See, birth control, especially the birth control pill, when it became available in 1960, was available only to married women in many states. And some women wanted to drop this condition and to increase availability to everybody. Successes of the women's liberation movement of the 60s and 70s was the passage of what is now known as Title IX, which is essentially a broadening of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It is part of the Education Amendments, which prohibits sex discrimination in any educational program or activities that are funded by the federal government. So basically, this prohibits schools and universities from receiving federal funds if they are found to be discriminating based on gender. So let's look at some of the impact of that. The black bar represents 1972, and the red bar is much more recently. So the number of girls playing high school varsity sports goes from 4% to 40% as a result of Title IX. Medical degrees earned by women went from 9% of the total to 43% of the total as a result of Title IX. Law degrees earned by women went from 7% of the total to 47% of the total, again, as a result of Title IX. But Title IX raises the question, should equal opportunity be provided when there are not equal participants? Another impact of the women's movement of the 1960s and 70s is the Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade, which was decided in 1973. Roe v. Wade is a Supreme Court decision that was made under the Nixon administration, which protects a woman's right to terminate a pregnancy in the first trimester. Now you notice that I have a little star or an asterisk by the word right. This is not because I'm trying to say it is or is not a right. This is me simply saying that I understand that there are a diverse number of opinions on whether or not a woman has a right to terminate a pregnancy. Some say she does, some say she does not, and where you fall on that is completely up to you. Nevertheless, the court argued that the Constitution's First, Fourth, Ninth, and 14th Amendments protect an individual's zone of privacy. And then the court goes on to argue that the zone of privacy was broad enough to encompass a woman's decision whether or not to terminate her pregnancy. And so, of course, we know that the debate over Roe v. Wade has not ceased to this day. You do have people that would like to keep abortion safe and legal, and you have people on the other side of that debate who would like to see abortion ended or limited. Again, where you stand on these issues is completely up to you. Moving forward with the impact of the women's movement is the renewed push for the Equal Rights Amendment of 1972. The ERA, as we know, was authored by Alice Paul in 1923, and it reads, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." It asserts that women should be included as a protected class of citizens under the 14th Amendment, and to this day it has not passed. It has been ratified by Congress, but not by the states. And so as you can see, there's a broad a coalition of states, especially in the South and a few in the Southwest, and then a grouping in the West that are still opposed to the passage of the ERA. Texas has ratified the ERA. just to mention in passing. So why is this? Why the controversy around the ERA? Much of the opposition to the ERA owes its beginnings to this woman, Phyllis Schlafly. Phyllis Schlafly is the leader of a conservative women's organization which coalesced around this issue, the ERA, around 1972. She's one of the most vocal opponents of the ERA, and she believes that it would lead to unisex bathrooms and requiring of women to serve in combat. She also says that the ERA will take away a woman's right to be, and this is a quote, supported and protected by men. Betty Friedan apparently wanted to burn Phyllis Schlafly at the stake. Feminism is doomed to failure, wrote Phyllis Schlafly, because it is based on an attempt to repeal and restructure human nature. What I am defending is the real rights of women. A woman should have the right to be in the home as a wife and mother. Well, let's focus our attention now from the women's movement to the Latino or the Hispanic movement. People with family origins in Spanish-speaking Latin America are collectively called Hispanics or Latinos. Now, identification with one or more of these terms varies from region to region. In my experience, Texas often favors Hispanic, while California uses the term Latino. In the United States, Mexican Americans, often known as Chicanos, have always made up the largest Hispanic group. During World War II, because of the shortage of farm labor, Congress approved the Bracero program, or farmland program. It encouraged Mexican immigration to fill labor needs in agriculture. The Braceros were granted work permits, that is, temporary resident status. And over the next 25 years, you see over 4 million Mexican immigrants who come to live within the United States. Now, Latinos often face discrimination within the United States. Many states applied Jim Crow laws to persons of Hispanic descent. And after World War II, you see Hispanic organizations beginning to fight back against this unfair treatment. One of the people that we'll highlight is named Hector P. Garcia, who formed the American GI Forum to battle discrimination as it affected returning World War II soldiers, and especially those of Hispanic descent. Encouraged by the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the 1970s, a specific and self-identifying movement of Hispanics began to coalesce. And the most influential Latino activist was a man named Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez was born in 1927 in Arizona. He was the son of Mexican immigrants, and Chavez moved with his family to California when times got really tough during the Great Depression. There, they joined thousands of other migrant farm workers moving from job to job and living in tents, cars, or ramshackle cabins. Chavez joined the Navy during World War II, but when he returned home, he found life unchanged for many of his Mexican migrant workers. It was characterized by long hours, deplorable conditions, no job security, and no benefits. And so with his fellow organizer, a woman named Dolores Huerta, Chavez organized the United Farm Workers, or the UFW, in Delano, California in 1962. Their goal was to improve the lives of migrants by bringing national attention to their plight. A popular biographer of Cesar Chavez wrote this: "One saw in him what one wanted to see. For religious clergy, it was a Christian movement. For youth, it was a communal mystical movement. For political radicals, it was a labor class struggle. For liberal intellectuals and politicians, it was a movement of hope and the American essence. And for others, Chavez was another Gandhi." To gain attention and support for his movement, Chavez organized in 1965 a boycott on grapes, which is a staple of the California agribusiness. Chavez uses a combination of Christian piety and nonviolent tactics. He looked up to Martin Luther King in order to achieve his goals. The idea was to get the public to stop buying grapes, and the agribusinesses then will have to meet with workers' demands for better conditions, job security, and some kind of treatment as genuine human beings. By 1970, he had achieved success when 7 major grape growers in California agreed to worker demands. It was a step toward achieving Chavez's goal of better treatment of Mexican-American migrant workers. Let's shift our attention once again, and this time we'll look at Native Americans or American Indians in the U.S. Well, as you recall, the American government had tried to exterminate Native Americans in the 1870s through the Indian Wars. One of the ways that they did this was by targeting the buffalo. If you can exterminate the buffalo, then you destroy the Native Americans' means of subsistence on the Great Plains. In the late 19th century, as the Progressive Era took hold, the policy shifted from one of extermination to assimilation. And we recall the famous Carlisle Indian School, which most famously attempted to kill the Indian and save the man by transforming his habits, his haircut, his speech, his religion, and everything that was Indian about him into that of a white man. Then again, you look at the Dawes Act of 1887, which was a way in which American Indian patterns of life were disrupted because all recognition of tribal claims to land was dissolved, and the Indians were encouraged to resettle on new land and become Jeffersonian farmers. In 1924, Native Americans were at last granted citizenship under the administration of Calvin Coolidge. In 1934, the Indian New Deal reversed the Dawes Act and gave Native Americans greater control and autonomy over some of their land. But by 1960s, you see a new generation of Native Americans ready to assert their heritage and their place in society. And again, you have to think about this in terms of 1960s political theater and cultural activism. This is another group that is rising up from what they consider to be the ignored parts of American history and trying to assert themselves not as adjunct Americans, but as a genuine part of the American mosaic. This coming of age, or cultural consciousness, is perhaps put best by D. Brown, the author of Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, published in 1970. Only occasionally was the voice of an Indian heard. And then, more often than not, it was recorded by the pen of a white man. The Indian was the dark menace of the myths, and even if he had known how to write in English, where would he have found a printer or a publisher? The American Indian Movement, also known as AIM, officially organized in 1968. Like the other civil rights groups, the Women's Organization or the Chicano Movement, they took the form and the language of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. They aimed at addressing all civil rights issues, particularly securing of land, legal rights, and self-government for Indians. In 1969, the Indian activism became more militant, and a group of Native Americans seized and occupied the island of Alcatraz in the San Francisco harbor, which was the site of an abandoned federal prison. They claimed that the island was theirs, according to a broken treaty from the 19th century. Now, of course, the seizure of Alcatraz was not really about land, but about political theater. They wanted to dramatize the mistreatment of Native Americans. The statement of purpose is called "We Hold the Rock." We feel that this so-called Alcatraz Island is more than suitable for an Indian reservation, as determined by the white man's own standards. By this, we mean that this place resembles most Indian reservations in that it is isolated from modern facilities and without adequate means of transportation. It has no fresh running water. It has inadequate sanitation facilities. There are no oil or mineral rights. There is no industry, and so unemployment is very great. There are no healthcare facilities. The soil is rocky and non-productive, and the land does not support game. There are no educational facilities. The population has always exceeded the land base. The population has always been held as prisoners and dependent upon others. So you can see from these pictures, the Indian movement at Alcatraz was designed not to claim land, that battle has been lost, but to dramatize the plight of Native Americans in the United States. And so in conclusion, here is an overview of some of the rights-expanding legislation that came out of this period of social activism in the 1960s and early 1970s. First, there's the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. It's a proposed constitutional amendment to guarantee gender equality based on the 14th Amendment. You know it was passed by Congress in 1972, but has not yet been ratified by the necessary number of states. Then there's Title IX of the Civil Rights Act. Of course, the Civil Rights Act goes back to 1964 and Title IX to 1972. It outlaws gender-based discrimination based on, again, the 14th Amendment. Then you have the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, and this was part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. It eased restrictions, making it easier for Latinos and Asians to immigrate to the United States. And lastly, there's the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975, which gave Native Americans control over the natural resources on their reservations.